Hello, Maurizio. Good morning.
Hi.
Nice,
Hi, Julia.
nice to see you again after the beautiful lecture of yesterday.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I enjoyed very much being here with you and with all the fellows yesterday too.
Yeah, it was really fantastic, like the journey you set up and you walk us through like the marvels and the also intriguing work and very complex world of mycelium and how it relates to creative design, but also industry.
Indeed. Multifaceted.
Yes, absolutely. I want today I will pick up like some inspiration I got from yesterday, and I just want to perhaps go more in depth into some aspects.
Yeah.
But before doing this, because this video will be shared with an audience which couldn't take part to the lecture yesterday, I would like to ask you just to walk us through once again towards like your entangled practices. And also if you can just give us like some insights into the choice of the names.
All right.
Behind them, because they are quite intriguing. And also we are both like from an Italian background, so I might have access to some of them, but maybe not everybody listening or watching us in this moment might.
Absolutely. So, well, it all starts from Officina Corpuscoli. Officina Corpuscoli being my Amsterdam-based design research studio practice, where we work at the intersection of different disciplines, primarily design and life sciences, specifically microbiology, fungal biology, mycology, fungal biotechnology, to actually derive interesting intuitions and critiques and thoughts-driven processes, but also very much physical manifestations, which are rooted in, again, opportunities emerging when collaborating with microbial agents, and specifically with fungi, for impacting the material culture characterizing our society, which certainly needs a shift, a needed shift, given the urgencies we are facing from an ecological perspective. And Officina Corpuscoli, conscious, since the beginning it would have been a difficult name for some to digest, because certainly the Italian speakers can understand it and pronounce it, but most of the international speakers simply cannot. It basically stands for, now Officina is usually a word used for a garage, a workshop, a mechanical workshop where you bring your car to repair. So it's a workshop dynamic making environment. And corpuscoli, as one can understand from the very root, the Latin root, the corpus, stands for the body, but the corpuscoli are intended as a diminutive, so the little bodies. So if you put it together, it's the workshop where you engage, where you work with the little bodies. And that's how it came about. And it was a deliberate decision not to have the name of the studio being my name, conscious of the fact that the work that is developed at the studio is the work that manifests thanks to the contribution of the many. No matter which others we are talking about, if it's other human colleagues or microbial co-workers, but it's in fact a collaborative co-design process. So that's actually what concerns, let's say, the studio name. And then eventually we started a more industrial venture named initially Mogu, still existing as such, but also having expanded on a few other iterations and restructuring. And when we chose for Mogu, like for any name, as opposed to what I didn't do with Officina Corpuscoli, we wanted to choose for a short name, something that could be effective, something that we could play nicely graphically, but also that would have content and meaning. And among the different iterations we were playing with at that time, we stumbled upon one of the many, many different words that exist in Chinese for describing a fungus. And in fact, Mogu is one way to say fungus in Chinese, Mogu. And that inevitably, I mean, makes total sense, became the name of the company, and we started playing with it also graphically, also with our G becoming a mushroom upside down, and so on. So there were again, different reasons for that to happen. But more recently, we introduced, a bit as I anticipated, a restructuring of the company, where we introduced the mother company, conscious of our strong R&D identity and value. So we do actually develop a lot of technological solutions at Mogu. And so in this way, Mogu is now transforming into Skim, written S-Q-I-M. And skim is a word that came about by means of different iterations, thinking also about the fact that we work a lot with fungal tissue to create different skins. And of course, there are analogies and parallels when thinking also about some applications that we are developing, for instance, the so-called alternative leather space and so on. So it was a bit of a, it was conceived as a word similarly sounding to skin, but also thinking about a certain kind of structure that the company would have had, because today the company is, again, getting a little bit more organized, and it will possibly also expand in future years with other business lines, other verticals. So here the word scheme as a schematic kind of way to conceive the organization that needed some order in some ways. And so Scheme became this mother company, even if chronologically speaking, it got born after Mogu. And Mogu became a daughter company, so to say, but in fact not a company, a business line and a brand dedicated to interior solutions for interior and for the green building, so-called industry. On the other side, we also created another business line, vertical and brand, that is called EFEA, and that's spelled E-P-H-E-A. And EFEA was another name difficult to identify, simply because when you want to register a name as a trademark, as a registered trademark, the space out there is widely populated, particularly if you look also at the specific category that trademark needs to tackle. So think, for instance, about fashion. That is where we are working on today as well. And in fashion, you can well imagine that every single name has been already registered, more or less. We had fantastic names that came out of our sessions, creative sessions, but they simply were too risky to register, because it's easy that somebody at some point questions that, and then you've been putting value, you've been investing, you've been creating a brand, and then what, you change name? So you just cannot do that. EFEA came about as in reference to the hyphae. Hyphae being the fungal cells, like the single hypha, the single fungal cell called an hypha, together hyphae, together many hyphae, a mycelium. And it became this play with the sound of hyphae, but also we had the will and the need also to bring about another short name that should have been elicited some sensuality, a soft sound, feminine, to bring about that type of sensitivity, which I think is the feminine sensitivity, very important for it to permeate increasingly society if we really want to go through an effective shift of our functioning that needs some little adjustments, as we know. And so EFEA came about as, yet again, something we could play with nicely graphically, with the content related to, again, the fungal biology, so the hyphae, but also evoking almost like this kind of Greek goddess type of thing. I don't think any goddess called EFEA ever existed, despite some authors, Greek authors, that had similar names, or Greek cities. But that's a little bit the long story short of how the names came about. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. I see there is a lot of thinking, but I really like also the way you engage with the names in terms of sound and how they resonate, in order to maybe recall certain sensation connected either to the microbial world, or indeed like materials that you might develop together with mycelium.
Absolutely. It was about having the values that are, for us, part of our brands reflected already within the phonetics, the sound, and the sensations that the sound elicits.
Talking about values and talking about mind shift, the needed mind shift in our material cultures or material approaches to materials. And of course, this is quite relevant also for what the Future Materials Bank is trying to do, right? We live in a certain, like, we are immersed in a certain existing dominant material culture, material like approaches to materials, societal constraints, influences, economic influences. You are like within your practices, you're like really crossing industry, creative sector, design world, and you're just playing among all these, right? And all these different words are also like fueling each other, I imagine, within your practice. Thinking about, like, let's say, approaches and cultures that you encounter in these different disciplines. I imagine there are like we are in a transition period, so you might experience some more ecological approaches, which are really engaging with what the ecosystem is doing, like more like forward-looking approaches to understand and to engage and to respect also the entanglements and the interdependencies that there are between human practices and other than human practices. But there are still, like, I think, a dominant approach, which is more like based on expectations that we might have had from materials, right? How materials can be used and how they can be also exploited in a way for our own needs and purposes in a short-term approach. Thinking about mycelium, I mean, there is, of course, like all the question that mycelium has like a very strong agency, that there are so many different factors, like the kingdom of fungi is so diverse that you always encounter something perhaps unexpected in your relation with it. But I imagine there is also like this coexistence of control, like willing to control, especially when you have to respond to certain expectations from the outside world. And expectations are not like coming only from the industry, but they are coming also from, cultural institutions, perhaps, right? So like expectations of having a certain quality, having a certain durability of the product, and the collaboration with fungi, the collaboration with mycelium. When does one ends, if it does, and the other begins, or how they mingle together?
Yeah, it is a dialogue. It is a dialogue between also different spaces and operative modes, ethos, values, different when as belonging to different type of domains, let's say. So for me, it all starts from my studio. That's where all those explorations stemmed in the first place, and that's where they constantly return in order to then flow also back to industry and then echo back at the studio level. So again, that's why I say there is a strong dialogue, and I try to explain that. When working with bio-driven processes, in this case biofabrication-driven, but let's say processes rooted in life and therefore in the agency of your microbial co-workers, there are, at the studio level, working within the cultural space, a lot of positive values emerging to be found, for instance, in the uniqueness of every single piece of material you grow, if you let the material express itself. Therefore, again, valuing imperfection as a gift, as a big plus, rather than embracing the opportunity of being surprised and learning from an unexpected manifestation that your microbial co-workers reveal. And that is where you have really an opportunity for learning through processes rooted in observation, listening. It's overall sensorial processes where you must feel engaged, and you end up strongly empathizing, if that's how you say it, with the other, the non-human other, the living cultures that you are studying or collaborating with for a certain purpose. Of course, these values completely differ when you move to another industry, and that's a little bit the dilemma, and that's where it gets a little schizophrenic at times if you do not keep a good balance, because it's simply, the industrial world simply functions differently, and what we are doing and what we've been doing since the beginning still with the company is attempting to positively infiltrate existing industry, working with its tools, which are the same that we are also questioning in the first place, and morphing them from within. It's of course a path, and it's not a war. It's about being able to demonstrate that it is possible to do things differently and responsibly, and to limit emissions, and to have a limited impact, and to take care about the full life cycle of a material, and therefore the product in which the material is embedded in. However, industry, as we know it in contemporary times, very much the capitalist model that still permeates society, also calls for some standards which we decided are standards that derive from the developments that took place in the past few centuries, something less than that, through industrialization, the perfection, the ability to perfect surfaces and so on. And so we all get used to a material culture which is not anymore an honest culture simply because materials surrounding us in our everyday life do not speak at all about the origin of the product that we eventually buy and consume, and eventually, unfortunately, dispose of, without taking into account, again, the long-lasting qualities of the materials that are used in the product, and therefore this kind of strange, this out-of-sync situation where materials and products are not well thought for being processed according to the cycles of, or the theoretical cycles of all existing things, where everything transforms in other uses and forms after having lived and having been utilized. So this to say that, of course, when you bridge to industry, you need to get acquainted with the fact that you need to respect certain requirements for standards. And that is allowing for a transition to happen, a transition that one day may bring us to, as a society, as a collectivity, to appreciate the uniqueness and the imperfection that you find in the cultural space as values, but that today does not. Because in fact, once the senses get involved and once we perceive the language of a material. Yesterday there's been some interesting comments about the fact that certain images or certain material languages can be disturbing for some. And this is not only related to the visual senses, but it's also related to smell. There's been interesting remarks about, oh, that can be quite revolting. The point is, we are here basically denying in industry the reality of existing things. When it comes to life, when it comes to transformation, when it comes to fermentation, when it comes to change and metamorphosis, let me put it, of any existing thing that transitions through different stages through metabolic processes, we shouldn't think about the neutral kind of feedback from this type of processes. It's processes that include a certain type of visual information, a certain type of olfactory experience, and again, all senses can be involved. So it is in fact quite challenging at times, because it is possible for us humans to control some biological processes and perfect them as much as possible, allowing, say, a material to fall within an acceptable range of properties that make it suitable for a certain market application, and therefore the market is ready to uptake the type of solution, provided that it's price competitive and all the other type of things. But it basically takes away from the real opportunities that emerge when dealing with the living, simply because at some point you have to kill your material and you have to fully neutralize all the sensorial properties it embeds, in order to make it suitable for an audience that just doesn't want anything to interfere with the neutrality of their everyday environments. And this is all of us, including probably me and you, because we are used, we created, we are born, we are embedded in this type of perception of space or idea of standard, but it's a very recent standard. So for me to come to a quick conclusion, it's about, I think, a real transition in terms of society when it comes to really reconciliating our role, our culture with the natural system, ecosystem we are part of. Well, it's fundamentally this reconciliation is funded on the appreciation of the fact that everything morphs, everything transforms, everything changes, and the agency of living materials allows you to understand, embrace, and push further this idea of, again, cooperation within a multitude of agents characterizing and being present in the ecosystem. So I don't know if I answer your question, because of course I'm opening up a lot of other points over here, but it's a fine line and it can be challenging. Yet it's very important that the domains keep informing each other. So it's not the transfer of a sensitivity or an information from one to the other and that's it. It's a continuous feedback loop. And that's why for me as an individual involved both in the cultural space and in the industrial space, it's very important to keep strong the values that exist in the cultural space, to allow them to penetrate as much as possible industry, to learn how industry reacts, bring back that experience at the studio level in the cultural space, and again, keep performing this iteration that is also contributing to make me learn and grow, literally, and understand better how I could also strategically be able to infiltrate the status quo and possibly also morph it for the good.
Thank you. I mean, there's a lot I would like to unpack here. I think I will come back to this later. I think there's also a bit the risk of romanticizing both ecology, like the ecosystem, and I really like, what you're saying about the importance of engaging with the morphoses happening in nature. But morphosis means degradation, death, as you mentioned yesterday. I really like that, as well as regeneration, growth, like fertile growth, fertility, and so there are these aspects are actually continuously nurturing each other, right, in these cycles. And I think it's also important not to romanticize the cultural sector and cultural institutions, but I know you're very much aware because we spoke about it yesterday as well, about how also certain art institutions or cultural institutions are also sharing the same ethos of control, of standardization that we might encounter in other sectors, like, for instance, the industrial one. So it's interesting, perhaps to look more into individual practices or collective practices of artists or designers, where really, there could be really openings and spaces where a new approach or really the embracement of imperfection can arise. But this is not my question. My question is actually reconnects with what you said about the honesty, this idea of honesty in relation to materials, which I find super interesting. And again, the idea of honesty is, of course, a way of projecting human features, human characteristics on the material world. Honesty is normally interpreted as a good quality, culturally speaking. So I might imagine that if we believe that there are honest materials, as you brought the examples of mycelium, in terms that it shows what it is, right? Which are the dynamics, where it comes from, the dynamics behind it. I think also I want to add to an expert eyes. Because if we see a sheet of mycelium without seeing the layering of the structure, it might be also quite difficult to grasp. But while there are other kind of materials, and we spoke about fossil-based materials mostly, which might not be considered honest, or at least sort of covering the political, economic, and social, and the many entanglements they have with the structural system behind them. So I wonder, but then eventually yesterday during your lecture, you also concluded, or more towards the end, you said that a material, it can be good or bad, but it very much depends on our approach to it, how we use it, how we really understand it, and how we are conscious in our material practices. So if you can just expand between these two approaches or these two.
Yeah, now, a material, I think, or any technology, any tool, cannot be looked at in a judgmental way. It's simply something, it's a fact, it's something that exists. And my point, what I was making yesterday in regard to technologies, but also to materials that we think might be very virtuous, such as what we do today with mycelium. We just don't think, we measure it, we quantify the positive impact that it creates, or the reduced negative impact compared to the status quo when it comes to emissions, consumption of resources, and things like that. So we are doing this work consciously and scientifically through quantified data. So we try to be as precise as possible in collecting this type of information, but we shouldn't take for granted, nevertheless, that what we deem positive, sorting a positive impact, necessarily will do that, because every action has implications, consequences. So what I was advocating for is the importance of keeping a very critical eye, a very critical approach, a very critical perspective, and keep questioning also the good that you think is contained in anything you're bringing about, because mostly often, as the past reveals, we humans have not proven very capable and effective in anticipating the implications and the consequences that technologies such as polymers, synthetic polymers that were created not that long ago, looking at evolutionary timescapes, it's very recent stuff, had and have had, as we know, on the ecosystems. And this was not taken into account at the beginning simply because there was not that type of expectation. Or maybe then in history along the years, some information has been also hidden deliberately. Of course, then there's interest, politics, money, and capital involved, and then things start getting nasty. But this to say that we should just be very wise and not be judgmental a priori about the positive or about the negative either, as that is a typical situation where technologies, particularly when you look at life sciences and, for instance, genetic engineering, tend to be judged a priori as something negative because, of course, we cannot control the implications that derive from a man-made organism being developed for a certain purpose. It's very difficult to generalize things in such way, and it's complex subjects that must be tackled on a collective level, tackling also the ethical implications that they bring about. But that's where I think that design as a discipline, as a fundamental responsibility to act as a tool, as an investigative tool for allowing also others that perhaps are today non-competent actors to get acquainted with the nature of, for instance, complex information that a certain public usually couldn't digest because lacking the background studies and so on. So design can facilitate the process of understanding and comprehension of such complex informations by not simplifying, but rendering more accessible such information, and therefore allowing the greatest collectivity to enter the debate in a informed and conscious way without just a position which is based on a fear, which is just, in my modest opinion, very silly to listen to, and it happens very many times, simply the conviction of somebody to just be right because that is wrong. I just do not share that perspective. What was the first part of your question instead?
I'm going to pick it up again now. It's about, actually, I'm tapping also a little bit about this. We spoke many times about collaboration in relation to Mycelium. Yeah. And you might be acquainted, and like the first part of my question was related to the different facets of ecological thinking, of the ecosystem, the, you know, like more pleasant ones and the more confronting ones.
Yeah.
I want to reflect about, you might have heard about the research in terms of mycelium economies or fungi economies by Toby Kears.
Transactions, yeah.
Exactly, indeed. So we know that actually fungi are also quite, you know, selfish or how can I frame it?
Yeah, they have their own interest and they defend their own space and they negotiate.
Exactly. They are negotiators, so there are like some resonances and comparable dynamics between capitalism, if we want, human capitalism, and economic forms that we might encounter in the natural realms, which is, in my opinion, extremely interesting because it allows us to unpack and to open up the concept of economy beyond what the dominant understanding of economy is, which is like the capitalist one, the market, the monetary, and so on and so forth. And I think this is also important in order to be, you know, think critically and perhaps also imagine and speculate about more ethical approaches within economies or more ethical forms of economies. So my question is actually, if we can imagine to be inspired by the mycelium, by the fungi world in order to rethink our practices, being them economical ones or artistic ones, how do you think like your, you know, like quite a long collaboration with mycelium, and so mycelium has influenced and intruded into your practice, influencing it? Quite a bit. And also I would like specifically to focus maybe not so much on your educational and research career, like work, more like into the one of the designer and mostly the entrepreneur. Mm-hmm.
So provided that I think that the work that Toby Kears has been developing along the years is just brilliant, it is also an interpretation, very much mediated by humans. So of course there is a strong human factor there when actually bringing about a theory which can be demonstrated because, in fact, you can test this type of call them negotiations, transactions, or whatever dynamics that happen among different living species in a very tiny sample of soil, where so many microbial communities are living, and we totally fail yet to understand what's going on there. I mean, we don't even know exactly who is there. When we know who is there, we don't really know how communication takes place effectively. Yes, it's molecular communication. We do understand something more than a few years back. Year by year we progress, but it's still a very, very limited understanding, our capacity to really map and decipher the complex molecular language, and perhaps it's not just molecular, that makes it very, very kind of dry and scientific. Perhaps there's something more to life than just chemistry. But yet we cannot define and understand fully the chemistry today. So that's one important aspect. So this just to say that this type of approaches are, of course, filtered through our sensitivity, and the parallels are created by us with our economy. And you could say maybe that's a natural, normal manifestation that you find a correspondence at also in the microspheres. But again, chicken and the egg. What are we inspired by our own culture to actually interpret, therefore, the functioning of natural ecosystems? That's a question. I have no answer about that. Provided that it is important not to romanticize, of course, the notion of nature, to think about nature as this perfected kind of image, living in this romantic beauty, stillness, and so on. It's nothing like that. Nature is very dynamic, can be brutal if we want to put a judgment to it at times. But again, it's a flow, it's dynamically evolving, it's transitioning in every moment, it's changing, it's morphing, it's reassembling, and this due to the participation of every single agent and agency. Every action has an impact, has an implication. So nature morphs accordingly, and we as part of it. So that brings me back to your fundamental question, which was
how Mycelium is intruding into your entrepreneur practice, especially, but the design one as well.
It has been intruding very positively in the sense that it starts from the design once again before the entrepreneurial. So I have to start from that by necessity, because it's working with Mycelium also allows you to enter some different state of perception, or a different kind of understanding, to deep dive into other dimensions. And I'm not here talking about fungi as great counselors for whatever psychedelic experiences. I'm not touching upon this here. I'm touching upon the capacity to fall into a process of all-round involvement in terms of sensorial involvement and devotion to understand what happens on a petri dish rather than in a certain whatever shaking culture flask, rather than in a bioreactor, rather than in any kind of other setup experiment, if we want to call it such. And that calls also for, on the side, emphasizing for empathy to be applied to that type of relation, because that is also a way in which you communicate with the living non-human other. And also you start surpassing your limited senses by having access to even simple tools such as microscopy, and then all the more advanced ways to deep dive into the microscopic world and the microscale. And you really start venturing into landscapes that transport you somewhere else. And it's not just about the fascination to be traveling through these landscapes that also fuels your imagination and opens up different types of thoughts and intuitions. But it's also the observation of the dynamics characterizing microbial communities as a whole that becomes really significant. Because what you start realizing, it's about the capacity of the community as such to work as a greater whole and not as the single parts. Of course, the community is made out of many cells, and easy are the parallels and the metaphors to human society, the individual and the global society, and we as a collective. But in fact, the collective in a microbial world works in function of the collective, not of the individual. So also the individual works in function of the collective. It's for the benefit of the culture that the cell decides to kill itself in order to let the rest of the cluster of cells progress. this is very inspirational also from the point of view of how we should look at natural systems and not only be inspired, but also really deep dive and work with them in order to inform the functioning of our society in aspects where we are greatly failing, as in fact, as human society, we yet dramatically fail in recognizing our fundamental interconnectedness, interdependence, and we today even luckily talk also about the relationship with the non-human others, but we have not been very successful among each other so far. So again, this is a great opportunity over there. Then how this infiltrates the industrial perspective, now it's easy that the notion of control that we were bringing about before enters the picture, because of course when you're in industry, you are presumptuously striving for reaching a standard which allows you to deliver something that the industry could take up and that is consistent and so on and so forth. And that is what we do. We succeeded in doing that. Of course, we're working with biology, so we always fall within an acceptable range. It's not chemistry that is so deterministic. There's always a little bit of variability that you can expect, like in everything, even like a plant, even like a crop, a corn plant and the other corn plant, like 50 centimeters far from it, they are two different plants. Even if they are on the same soil, they are two different biomasses. So that is where somehow I think, yeah, it is an interesting mediation, the one happening in industry, because no matter if you rely on the fundamental agency of your microbial co-workers, at the same time, you must, in the contemporary framework, also be presumptuous enough to feel and to strive to be in control. Control is key. And we elude ourselves about the fact of being in control, and possibly will incrementally feel like we are in control, but bringing it back to the cultural world, one important reflection for me has always been the one of saying, back in the days, you know, when working with fungi, I feel like being the choreographer and the fungi being the dancers, and I'm therefore just guiding their movements, instructing them on what to do, and everything happens because of them. The show without the dancers is not taking place, so big thanks to my dancers. But then I also figured out very quickly about how presumptuous was that, as in fact it could simply be the other way around. And it's not so far-fetched to think about you, human or humans, being controlled by the fungi in order to accomplish a certain mission that they had strategized about a long time ago, provided that they are around since much, 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 much longer than we humans are, and that we have evolved from them.
And they are much, much, much more complex and diverse than our species is, right? Yesterday we were talking like something also very interesting you mentioned yesterday, I didn't know, the 12% diversity in the genetics of the fungi, the kingdom of fungi.
Yep.
And you made like a comparison of the 2%, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, so basically there's, what I was saying is that in some cases, again, we can think about the fungal species out there, they're estimated in more than 5 million species, probably there are even more, it's an estimation, and of those we have described, and we know in the sense that we have scientifically described as very small percentage of them, about a 10-12%, meaning that describing them is not understanding them and knowing them. We have described something about them, so there's still plenty to learn about those. And nevertheless, there are strains, so you have to think about all the fungal families, there are many. Then you go within one family, and within that family there's many species, and then within the species you pick one, and within that species there's strains, in fact, that have the same name and surname. You could say they're all called the same, brothers and sisters, exactly the same guys, sort of, not really, because they can differ up to 12% genetic difference in terms of genetic material, meaning that between man and chimp there's about 2 to 3%. That gives you a clear idea about what type of different universes they are. Each fungus is a universe on its own. Each fungus has its own need, has its own functioning. And they are very difficult to decipher, simply because we are still learning a lot about how these individuals, but particularly these communities, work, behave, exist, morph, evolve.
I completely agree with you that the complexity of the fungal world is completely escaping our capabilities, cognitive capabilities and sensorial capabilities as well. On the other hand, just bringing back like the discourse and also the politics of control back to the design world, the creative world and the industry world. So the one of human practices in as such. I want to bring up like the important topic of intellectual property in relation to mycelium especially. And I'm curious to hear from you, like what is, like for your experience, the state of the art in relation to, setting intellectual property rights onto certain bacterial strains or species or families.
Right.
Not bacteria, sorry, fungi.
It's a complex subject. Now, let's start again from the creative practice. Creative practice very much prone and devoted to the introduction of approaches which are rooted in cooperation, the co-design, co-anything. So this idea of working on open perspectives, and open frameworks that allow also for others to build upon the findings of a peer, of somebody that has been doing that before. Not something very different from what is a little bit more pragmatically regulated in academia in some ways. You know, building upon somebody else's findings and then through a very structured type of approach when it comes to academia, maybe in the open design paradigm, it's a little looser, there's a little bit more spontaneity, flexibility, and then there's always questions that relate to ownership nevertheless, because open access doesn't mean necessarily free, which is another kind of type of discussion. But of course, when you come to industry, what happens? That you start having some constraints, because of course, you have been investing time, you have been investing resources. Sometimes we're talking about many years to develop a certain type of expertise, and you are nobody. No matter how much people have been talking about you or whatever, you do not matter. You are a small entity in the market world, in the industrial world, in the capitalist system. You are ready to be swallowed by the big shark. And the big sharks are many and are out there. And if there is something that can be of interest, they are very happy to come and take it without asking for permission. So there is where you have to be careful. There is where, again, you're trying to bring about a revolution, perhaps, or that's what you hope to be contributing to, that can strongly impact material culture, the way we produce, the way we conceive production, a paradigm shift that is not exploitative, that is generative, and all the good that comes with it, the cooperation with the non-human others, this new kind of renaissance through entanglement, and so on. And then you risk not being able to do the job because at some point somebody can just deprive you of everything that you have been doing. So that is one way why, as an individual running a company, and as a company, therefore, you have the need of developing intellectual property. Intellectual property exists in many different forms. It can exist as industrial secrecy. So something that you know, it's your know-how, it's your process, it's your technique, it's your secret ingredient, and you know it and you only. Coca-Cola recipe. That's intellectual property. It's not a registered IP in terms of a patent. It's industrial secrecy. It's the well-kept secret. And that's the way to go about it. In this way, you don't publish about it. So nobody knows about it, and you just have to be sure about the confidentiality and the fact that the information doesn't flow out of your organization. And that is a form of protection, or a form of competitive advantage. So meaning I know I have the winning formula, and therefore I do not want anybody else to access it because it's mine and only mine, and that is what makes me special. Same applies to, and the special aspect is important, same applies to registered intellectual property. So you say, I have found something with ingenuity or with research or whatever that brings in an interesting inventive step, brings in something that represents novelty. There's some specific aspects that allow you to develop effectively intellectual property in the form of a patent, and therefore I write a patent where I describe let it be my process, my product, my tools. It depends what you are there protecting, all of it. And that I do, and of course, it's not guaranteed that I get granted that property, because it's complicated also. People can, of course, appeal against your patent. Of course, there's reviewers which will look at prior art and will question you. So it's a long path, actually, and very expensive also to hold patents. So one thinks well about this before doing it, and because, again, there's no guarantee, it costs a lot of money, so financially it's kind of demanding, and because it's in this way you publish. It's a different way of publishing where, again, there's a time where you might not have something granted, but your invention is published, and of course it depends how you described it. How general is it? How overall encompassing is talking about whatever, 20 different fungal species, for instance, and different types of process parameters and so on, meaning that information needs to be interpreted. And nobody, by reading a patent, will be able to emulate your process specifically because it needs to be interpreted, and you need to have also the right materials to work with. So there's a lot of variables, and yet you explain a general kind of principle that people can possibly also decipher, but they cannot copy for 20 years if they are granted, if it is granted, meaning that you are basically at that point deciding to use that owned invention, that property, in fact, in a different ways. On a side, you can decide to use it to limit others to enter that space, and unfortunately that happens also in the mycelium space. Or you can decide to use it to protect yourself from the fact that somebody might come one day and try and take it away from you, and they cannot. Because if they do, they are going to have our time, because you are going to have your lawyers contacting them. And again, of course, that is also what allows you to develop different type of schemes, such as business models based on licensing. If you do not have an ownership, what do you license? That is a way, actually, to distribute the technology, to provide its diffusion, to foster its diffusion, by having other companies buying a permission to use the technology and you providing that technology. But in that way, they can actually implement it and you can guide them. Of course, you don't give it for free, because in the end, you need to survive too. I mean, in an ideal world, it would be fantastic. However, either the world switches instantly, or if you are the only fool that decides not to practice this, that means you're dead tomorrow. And that is very controversial. Plus, it's important to think about the fact that when thinking about a young initiative, any organization, you need, at some point, you need some means. Okay, money always sounds like dirty talking. In contemporary society, this is the currency. I would be very happy that that would change and that we would find a different way. But it's currency, and that's how it all works, unfortunately, at this moment. If you need to grow, you need somebody believing in you. Of course, you can do it by selling products, you generate revenues, and you reinvest your revenues and so on. But in any case, if you are doing technological innovation, you need somebody investing in you. And somebody invests in you if you have something that makes you that special. If you do not have that special thing, nobody is interested in doing that, because why should I choose you? What does that guarantee to me if I put a certain amount of resources over there and the interest of me as an investor is tomorrow to have multiplied those amounts by 3, by 5, by 10, or by whatever it is? And so, again, it is complex because, again, it brings in this notion of ownership, which can be tricky and trivial and can contribute to limit the expansion of a technology or the diffusion of the technology itself. But it can exactly have the opposite effect too. So fundamentally, yet again, it's about the tool. The patent or the intellectual property is a tool. How do you want to use it? And how can you, if you're truly trying to democratize a certain practice that today, as in the case of mycelium materials, is not practiced by many, how can you use your intellectual property to help others, or also to help yourself, because you can derive revenues to come in the space? But that can be becoming very tricky, because, for instance, that's something that happened in the mycelium space, where a lot of people do not enter because, despite the fact that there's a few actors, very few, globally, to count them on less than the fingers of a single hand, that are attempting to work industrially, there's a lot of the potential intellectual properties already being covered. So bad that there is even some basic principle being patented that revolves around the principle of fungi growing on biomass as an invention of a company, which is, of course, not. It's a natural technology. And that can be very tricky. And in fact, designers are very scared by this.
Yes, absolutely. I really like actually how you navigate between these controversies and complexities of the transition that we are living, right? That we are experiencing. And of course, like I believe that it is indeed problematic when we try to set ownership rights on something which is ongoing since much longer than we are on Earth.
Yeah.
So, and also when we are trying to redefine our whole society, right, and all the different societies connected to each other, in order to try to repair the damages that we have done on this planet, we probably need to share. We probably need to collaborate more. So also, but
in an ideal world.
In an ideal world, but we also need. You are like an idealistic person, I learned. Yeah. So we also need like to be inspired by ideals, right, and by utopias as well, in order to rethink our practices. But at the same time, also like the Future Materials Bank as a project is working with a lot of very young designers, very young artists who are really like struggling and surviving in the very difficult world which is outside there. So we want also to be, we engage very like seriously with the question of intellectual properties. We never force anyone to open or to share fully. Of course, we always invite them, but we don't force them to share their recipes, to share their practices. Although I think like the Creative Commons, for instance, the open source models, there are like some interesting tools outside there that on which we might experiment.
But also Creative Commons is based on licensing. It's a different framework, but still there is ownership.
Yes.
So it's not about everything is open and it's for free and everybody can take and just do whatever with it. Of course, there's different types of Creative Commons licenses. And I think actually that it's interesting that you bring it about, because with another person that drives another company that is also active in the Mycelium space, but a person I'm very good friend with too, despite being also competitors. We have been thinking quite a few times about the potential opportunity to work together, and we had a few sessions working on this, how to introduce Creative Commons in industry. So a different form of licensing that could really foster a quicker development of the whole field. We tried. And it's been a few years ago, and it proved really too difficult for anybody to even be willing to listen to that. It looked more as a bit of a waste of time at that moment.
Yeah.
And so it's not like forgotten, it's still relevant, but society needs a lot of time for transitioning and shifting its cultural approaches, particularly when it comes to capital and all that moves this world.
Takes a lot of time in a moment when we don't have time, right? So this is also the conundrum of our moment. Yeah. It's super interesting. We might carry on like talking about it.
We could make a summit about this.
But I want just like maybe like bring it back to like the design and to the practices. You just also said that there are actually very few actors working actively with Mycelium. There are like very little products surrounding us. Although we are actually immersed in fungal networks, we have very little objects, like Mycelium-based objects around us. Which ones do you think are the biggest challenging that we might, and how you imagine that we could potentially overcome them in order to be also surrounded by Mycelium-based like Mycelium entanglements which are visible and tangible? Right.
So let's put it this way. Let's start from the fact that the enthusiasm is sky high at this moment. When I started doing this type of work, it was 2009, there was great skepticism. There was not this hype. It didn't exist. Actually, there were hardly informations around about how to cultivate even fungi for the purpose of growing mushrooms, if not thanks to Paul Stamets and other people that have been starting disseminating about this, but also the web, which was at 2009, sounds like not many years ago, but in this kind of 12, 13 years, lots has happened. Also, the web didn't have all the contents and all the functionalities and the apps and the social networks that exist today. So it's been big shift happening within a very, very short time frame. So again, back in the day, skepticism. Last 4 years, let's put it that way, 4, 5 years, big explosion of enthusiasm about fungi, so much that they are on the headlines of magazines, of newspapers, TV channels, popular programs, celebrities speaking about mushrooms, and a lot of hype around it, which is very positive. And I couldn't have predicted that, to be honest, as fond as I am of the subject. But that was not the reason for doing what I was doing by then.
Maybe you contributed also to this enthusiasm.
Hopefully, I hope so. But this to say that in the recent years, there's been a lot of ferment, a lot of explosion of passionate fellows, designers, scientists, research groups, and in some cases, companies that came about in order to keep developing, again, the subject. First of all, mostly often, what we witness is an everlasting repetition of what has been already done, which is the usual story of reinventing the wheel. It's okay to start by reinventing the wheel, but that needs to be just a starting point, and it's not a point of arrival. That's what some players fail to understand. Copying what has been done before is not making you special. It just allows you to temporarily position yourself, and that's a strategy that many students, for instance, use. Just doing what others have been doing in order to be spoken about as the guy that is doing an incredible thing, which then you read about and you're like, yeah, I mean, I'm happy for you. However, okay, next step. There's always something missing, and there's a lack of understanding about the complexity that dealing with such processes entails, because there's a common misconception about the fact that it must be easy to grow mycelium materials. You need some plant matter, just season it with some fungal mycelium, create the right conditions, incubate it, and something will grow and you have a product. No, it's a much longer journey, then it's very complicated, and you need to know what you're doing. Some people think they know what they're doing because they buy the kit. So there's kits commercialized, and you can buy the kit and just hydrate it and then grow something, and you think, I grew a material. Well, no, not really. You're provided with the illusion you did, but in fact, you know nothing about how that material has been prepared, and you cannot intervene in changing the qualities of that material because it's been preconceived and predetermined. Also there, I see the value of the type of products that are, though, there for me more for a wow effect rather than for somebody that really wants to be seriously contributing to the development of a field. You don't work with the stuff that somebody else makes for you. You need to know what you're doing. Because it's so complex, everything that happens behind it.
Sure. I think it depends on the practices, though. Like, for instance, we're in an art academy, so if everybody would really focus on developing a material, that would be also narrowing down the diversity of the practices. So sometimes you just use something which has been developed by us.
In that sense, it is very useful. The only problem I have with that is that if it's for an art project, perfect. If it's for somebody that pretends to say that they are making a product with that something, you don't even know what it is. You don't even know the properties. You didn't choose for the fungus. You didn't choose for the substrate. You didn't choose for the environmental conditions. You didn't choose for anything. So every parameter that contributes to inform the properties of the material that you have as an output is not there anymore. So you are not, let's say that the opportunities that that process offers are neglected a priori. So I understand the functionality, but again, for exploding the real value, there's great limitations in this type of approach. Having said that, again, lots of groups, also research groups, getting enthusiastic in the scientific world. I personally even collaborated along the years with universities that started new research lines thanks to the collaboration that we had together. So that's where you start seeing, back in the days, the great skepticism from the scientific practice towards creatives, which were always and are still very often misconceived as, the creatives, being in the atelier, creating, doing formal things. Well, no, design also is something else. And in fact, that value was understood in time through the relationships, so much that it contributed to create new departments, new research line, to really foster this incredible boom. And that's great. So something happens there. Then there's the mycelium passionate people that are also playing. Then there's young people in academia or in art academy or whatever that are doing their own thing while going through their studies, right, or immediately right after. And then usually everything stops there. Why is that? Because it's complex, and because you need to bring together a lot of different ingredients. You need to bring together competencies for yourself and by others. You need to involve others. You need to let go of your control. Also in that sense, it's like it cannot just be your work. You need to involve other expertise. You need to involve other knowledge, know-how, sensitivity, capacity to work in a different way with a different structure. And you need to mediate. You need to let go of your own control. And that is not easy. Plus, you need to find revenues. You need to find ways to support initiatives. So it's a long path, and it's demanding. And if you think that you want to have instant gratification, forget about it, because what you have to embrace is uncertainty. You know that you don't know anything. You know that you have a certain scope or objective that you will define along your way in terms of what you really want to do, but it will need time, and it will unravel as you go through it, and there's no guarantee about the fact that you're going to reach an outcome. So that is not an easy choice. Well, I think that a creative should be already acquainted with it. If you decided to go for the creative practice, it's certainly not a job at a bank, which gives you like the fixed salary and whatever, the certainty that some people look for. Yeah, that's one aspect. Plus, there is the complication about entering the space, provided that many creatives, and I saw that with students or with people that contact the studio regularly, are very afraid about what we were discussing a minute ago about the IP situation, the patents, intellectual property, and so on, and feel threatened by the fact that if they do something, somebody will just reach them with a letter of a lawyer and they will be in trouble. Which is not exactly how things happen, by the way, but it's understandable that the emergence of that type of fear, because there are players that can also be nasty, or that have been such in the past. So it's very complicated to deal with. But again, why there's not products out there? It's terrible. There's very few products. There's a lot of people talking about things out there and failing to correspond the expectations that they generate with an actual delivering of what they have promised. And this is the biggest problem of our contemporary time. Let it be that there's few players, there should be more, but even the ones existing should learn to play a more honest and a transparent role in society and in industry. I mean, it's nothing new that talking about something in a very sensational way can help fostering attention, having everybody converging on you, being on the tip of the tongue of every single body, and therefore attracting the interest of investors, venture capitalists, and so on. This is effectively the short-term benefit. But the point is that if in the end you're not able to deliver, as in fact we are witnessing since a while, big statements, big announcements, big promises, nothing in return that really is in the market and that really makes a change, well, then we have a problem. So this is a paradigm very typical of certain geographical ecosystems, and they call it fake it till you make it. I do not share this type of ethos. I think it's very deceiving and must be surpassed, because it's one of the sicknesses of our system. But nevertheless, if you want to go that way, fake it till you make it, but you gotta make it. Otherwise, don't even fake it, please. Because the effect is totally counterproductive, is a boomerang effect, not just on you, because again, might pay in the short term, but it will not in the long run. And the trust eventually disappears and fades. But plus, more than that, you even harm the actors that are trying to do things in a different way, because you create a disillusion in the market, in the industry, and in the consumers.
There is a big risk in short-term approaches, right? In trying like to survive or to just surf the last trend in order to remain on the surface.
I think, maybe just to conclude that thought, one should just simply, but that's my point of view, so there's no truth there. But instead of investing massive capitals and hundreds of thousands and more of dollars or euros in marketing and communication campaigns, perhaps one might need to invest that same amount of money in product development. Or in
R&D, yeah, absolutely. One last question, Maurizio. Yeah. If you should pick up one anecdote among the many that I'm sure you have, in order to express how fascinating but also unsettling is working with fungi and mycelium? Just your favorite ones, very briefly, just to wrap it up.
The fascination and the unsettling at the same time. It's a difficult question, this one.
But that's like the word of fungi, in my opinion. It's fascinating, but also unsettling somehow, right? It's like this big intelligence, right? That is very dispersed all around us. They're here since such a long time. It's very unsettling, in my opinion.
Oh, for me, it's more fascinating than unsettling. Okay. It's actually, I find comfort in that discomfort. It's somehow, I mean, again, I could speak about the first time I deep dived through a microscope with a good magnification capacity in microbial landscapes, and that was, other than unsettling, it was just finding yourself home. And the same on a more macro level, for instance, when, again, going through the fundamental processes rooted in observation and listening and sensorial experiences and engagement with the non-living other, what I referred to before, so the fact of witnessing phenomena that happen at a different time scale, because fungi are very quick-growing organisms compared to most plant matters and so on. But they are very slow compared to our way to perceive time and pace. So, in fact, focusing on long periods of transitions that can then be also put together, for instance, through the help of tools, photography, time-lapse, and so on, and going through the understanding of how a process unravels really allows you to develop ever more a certain fascination, develop a language, develop a system of interpretation, and that is something that is rather profound and that cannot really be, it's difficult even to express in words somehow, because it's a personal experience finally. It cannot be just translated in verbal means. But it's what allows for a connection to happen, and the connection is something you don't describe, the connection is something you feel. And that is why I keep striving on the importance of introducing elements in this type of work also that relate to empathy. And they can manifest in so many different ways other than the actual fabrication or biofabrication or coming together of a material. They can manifest through performance, for instance. The fact of bringing about new rituals also as part of a practice that might be pragmatic in the way it needs to, follow certain steps in order to achieve a certain outcome, but introducing within these steps specific rituals and specific performances also that can be benefiting others in order to express what one witnesses while going through a more pragmatic trajectory, I think is really vital, is really key, because it also allows others to access an information that will then be filtered through their own respective sensitivities, but yet it will be an access that otherwise sometimes a material on its own or a scientific process certainly cannot provide.
Yeah, this is the concept of empathy. I think it's very important as much as beautiful. Thank you, Maurizio. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Julia, to you and to Jan van Eyck, and pleasure to be here, and hope to continue the conversation soon.